The American Midwest, a region known for its open skies, quiet towns, and simple living. But beneath the surface of these peaceful landscapes lie some of the darkest chapters in American history. In the 1870s, a family of settlers known as the Bloody Benders lured travelers into their Kansas inn. Decades later, in 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, awoke to a scene of unimaginable horror. And in the 1950s, a recluse named Ed Gein shocked the world with his collection of human remains. His grotesque legacy shocked the world and inspired horror legends. The Wild West is known for its lawlessness, gunfights, outlaws, and lawmen. Murder was common in the Wild West, but the family we are covering today took it to a whole nother level: the Bloody Bender family. In October of 1870, John Bender Jr. and John Bender arrived in northwestern Lebec County. They were interested in purchasing land. They eventually bought 160 acres next to the Great Osage Trail. Very little is known about the family's origins, but it's believed that they were spiritualists, which was popular in the 19th century. Spiritualists believe that a person's soul continued even after death, and that spirits can communicate with the living. Mary Todd Lincoln was one of the most famous believers in spiritualism. It is unknown why the family chose Kansas. The father, John Bender, was around 60 years old. He spoke little English. It's believed he was German or Dutch. He would be known as Pa Bender. This is how a neighbor described him.
The old man was a repulsive, hideous brute, without a redeeming trait, dirty, profane, and ill-tempered.
The son, John Bender Jr., was around 25. He was described as handsome, with brown hair and a mustache. He was tall and thin. He spoke with a German accent, but spoke fluent English. Many believed that he was dim-witted. He would laugh at almost nothing. The two men built a cabin. It was 16 by 24 feet. A small 6-foot cellar was dug under the cabin. It was built along the Great Osage Trail. A barn was built and a well was dug. In the fall of 1871, the family's other half arrived in Kansas. The mother, Elvira Bender, was in her mid-50s. She would become known as Ma Bender. Her neighbors described her as a she-devil, since she had an unfriendly attitude. She spoke little English.
Old Mrs. Bender was a dirty old Dutch crone. Her face was a fit picture of the midnight hag that wove the spell murderous ambition about the soul of Macbeth.
And the daughter, Kate Bender, was around 23 years old. She was described as a beautiful woman who spoke perfect English with little to no accent. John Jr. and Kate were introduced as brother and sister, but many believe that this was a ruse. They were actually common-law husband and wife. The Benders used a canvas wagon cover to turn their small cabin into a 2-room cabin, with a kitchen and dining room table out front. A large orchard was dug around back. Pa Bender put up a sign in front of the cabin that said grocery, but it was misspelled, Grocry. Once Kate and Elvira arrived, it was replaced with a sign spelled correctly this time, groceries. Kate presented herself as a spiritualist and claimed to have psychic abilities. She advertised herself as a healer who could cure illnesses and speak to the dead. She also conducted seances at the inn. Kate's good looks and psychic abilities drew in people to visit the Benders' cabin. The Great Osage Trail was a main route for travelers headed further west or headed back east. Travelers could stop in and get a warm meal and a place to sleep for the night. Many of the people that stopped at the Benders' cabin for the night were alone. They were headed west, so they did not know anybody in the area. Eventually, people who had stopped at the Benders' Inn began to go missing. But murder was the last thing on people's minds. The West was a dangerous place. There were attacks from Native Americans. Poisonous snakes, wolves, and coyotes roamed the area. Bandits and outlaws were also hiding out. The road west was a dangerous place, and the Benders claimed that the missing guest had left the inn and continued on their way. There was little suspicion around the Benders at this time. In May of 1871, a man was found in nearby Drum Creek with his throat slit and his head crushed. The property owner was blamed for the murder, but no arrest was made. In 1872, 2 more men were found with these same injuries. There had been many reports of missing people in the area. They had passed through and stayed at the Benders Inn, and never arrived at their destination. People began going a different route, thinking that the bandits were killing travelers on the Great Osage Trail. George Newton Longcore was a Civil War veteran who lived in Independence, Kansas, a popular stepping-off point headed out west. In December 1872, after his wife died, he decided to move to Iowa for a fresh start with his infant daughter, Mary Ann. But George and Mary Ann never reached Iowa. They vanished along the Great Osage Trail, or so they thought. George and Mary Ann's old neighbor, Dr. William York, eventually learned of their disappearance, and he decided to look for them. He traveled the route that they intended to take. He questioned people along the way, and he made it to Fort Scott, Kansas. After he failed to find George and Mary Ann, he returned to Independence, Missouri on March 9, 1873, but he never arrived. Dr. York had 2 brothers who knew he was traveling along the route, trying to find the missing family, Ed York from Fort Scott and Colonel Alexander York. They both began searching for their missing brother. Colonel York set off with 50 men for the search. They stopped every traveler on the way and stopped at every homestead. He questioned them all about the disappearance of his brother. He was supposedly very aggressive and suspicious of everyone that he questioned. On March 28th, he reached the Bender Inn and explained that his brother went missing and he was searching for any information. The Benders admitted that Dr. York had stayed with them, but tried to convince the colonel that he probably ran into unfriendly Indians on the trail. Colonel York agreed that this could have happened. He stayed for dinner before continuing on his way. He stopped at a nearby homestead owned by the Roaches. He left feeling like they were involved in his brother's death. On April 3rd, Colonel York returned with his group of men after learning a woman had escaped from the Bender Inn after being threatened with a knife by Elmira Bender. John Jr. and Mary both denied the claims. Elmira claimed that the woman was a witch who cursed their coffee. She then told the men to leave. She had previously claimed not to speak English, but spoke it very clear during this confrontation. Mary went up to the colonel and asked him to return alone so that she could use her abilities to find his brother, but the colonel declined. Colonel York was convinced that the Benders had murdered his brother, but he needed to find more evidence. A few weeks later, a community meeting was arranged. Numerous people had gone missing from the Osage Trail, and people were convinced that someone nearby was responsible. Colonel York was at the meeting, and it is believed that John Jr. and Pa Bender both could have been at the meeting that day. It was agreed that every homestead between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek would be searched for the missing travelers. After Colonel York's visit to the Bender Inn, the family decided to flee the area. 3 days after the town meeting, a farmer named Billy Toll was moving his cattle past the Bender Inn when he noticed that the inn looked unkept and the farm animals had no food or water, and some had even died of malnutrition or from thirst. He fed and watered the animals, and then he reported this all to the township. It took days before anybody could reach the Bender Inn. When they finally arrived to search the inn, they noticed immediately that there were no possessions inside, no clothing or food. They immediately noticed a horrible smell coming up from the floor. They found a trap door in the floor that had been nailed shut. A bed covered the door. The horrible smell was coming up from this trap door. They opened the door and found clotted blood all over the floor in the cellar, which was 6 feet deep. It had a slab of rock at the bottom, which the cabin had been built on. The men used sledgehammers and broke up the floor. They were able to dig around but were unable to find any bodies. They believed that the smell was coming from blood that had soaked through the floor and into the ground. The men eventually moved the cabin off of its foundation so that searchers could dig underneath. Even after a thorough search, nothing was found. The searchers shifted their attention to the property, now looking for any disturbed soil, any graves, or any hiding spots that could house a body. The men probed the loose soil of the orchard. They felt something buried underneath. They dug down and discovered the body of Dr. William York. He was identified by the clothing and personal effects on his body. His skull had been crushed on the right side, and his throat was slit. The bodies that were found in 1871 and 1872 had the exact same wounds. They were killed the same way as Dr. York. He had been buried face down in a shallow grave. The searchers continued by probing the orchard. They believed that they had found 9 more bodies, but waited until daylight to dig them up. 8 more bodies were found in the orchard the next morning. Another body was found dumped down the well, along with numerous other body parts. Every victim had their throat cut and their head split by a hammer. George Longcore and his infant daughter, Mary Ann, were among the victims. The young girl was the only victim that had no injuries. It was suspected that she was either strangled or buried alive. She may have possibly been kept alive even after her father had been killed, and then killed sometime later. It was believed that the Benders used Kate to lure in the victims and give them a sense of security. Kate was a beautiful young petite woman. She would have their guests sit with their back to the canvas wagon cover that separated the family's living area. She would feed the victims and converse with them or give them spiritual readings. While Kate was distracting them, Pa Bender or John Jr. would sneak up behind them and hit them on the right side of the head with a hammer. Then, either Kate or Elmira would slit the victim's throat. All this was done either over the trapdoor or next to it, so that the body could easily be dropped through the door until it was safe to check the body for valuables and then bury the victim in the orchard. It is believed that the Benders chose the location in Kansas specifically for its remote location next to the trail. Travelers were often going through the route and did not have ties to the area. The Benders' wagon was found abandoned 12 miles from the inn. The horses were starving to death. Investigators had followed the wagon tracks. They also found out the Benders had bought tickets to Humboldt, Kansas on the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad. It's reported that John Jr. and Kate got off at Chanute, Kansas, and boarded the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, headed to Denison, Texas. From there, they went to a camp near the New Mexico border. Pa and Elmira Bender continued on the train to Kansas City, and then headed to St. Louis, Missouri. A $3,000 reward was put up. Many claimed to have killed the Benders, but no one produced evidence sufficient enough to collect the reward money. It was discovered that the Benders weren't a family. The only 2 that were even related were Elmira and Kate. They were mother and daughter. Pa Bender was not Kate's father, and John Jr. was not Kate's brother. In 1889, almost 16 years after the Benders fled, 2 women were arrested in Michigan on a tip that they were the fugitives, Elvira Bender and her daughter Kate Bender. The women named Elmira Monroe and Sarah Eliza Davis. The 2 women were extradited to Kansas. There they were charged with the Bender murders. Several witnesses came forward. The witnesses gave conflicting testimony, some insisting that Monroe and Davis were the Bender women. Others were not so sure. After the initial media excitement and weeks of testimony, the case against the women failed due to lack of evidence. Monroe and Davis were released. There are conflicting totals on the numbers of victims killed by the Benders. It's believed to be between 13 and 20. No one was ever convicted of the Bender murders. Officially, they all successfully escaped and escaped from justice. In the 1840s, the first white settlers came to the area of modern Villisca. Rich farmland as far as the eye could see. Originally, the town was called the Forks. A plat was laid out in 1858 by D.N. Smith of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. The town would then become Villisca, Iowa. It eventually would be a railroad town. The first sawmill reached Villisca in 1861. Local lumber would be cut to build the town. Villisca got its first schoolhouse in 1867, its first bank in 1871, and its first fire department in 1876. Villisca would grow quickly. By 1880, the population was 1,300. It had more than doubled in the past 10 years. In 1892, the town had a population of 2,000. Villisca was used to support the farms in the surrounding area. Farmers could get coal, seeds, animals, machinery, and supplies. There were many churches in the town of all different denominations. Multiple doctors were also located in town. The railroad in town was the main source of transportation of goods. This helped the town flourish for many, many years. Josiah Moore lived in the town with his family. He was a businessman who owned a farming and hardware store that would sell farming implements to local farmers, as well as items from the hardware store. Josiah Moore was 43 years old in 1912. He owned a modest, beautiful wood-framed home currently at East 2nd Street, with his wife, Sarah Moore, 39. They had 4 children. Herman Montgomery Moore was 11. Mary Catherine Moore was 10. Arthur Boyd Moore was 7, and Paul Vernon Moore was 5. By 1912, Villisca had a stable population at a little over 2,000 people. The Moore family, just like most families in the early 1900s, were very involved with their church. On the afternoon of June 9, 1912, the Moore family went to their Presbyterian church where there was a children event being held. Sarah helped coordinate the event. The kids played together, they had Bible studies and prayer groups, and the kids participated in plays. The Stallinger family was a farming family who lived just a few miles from town. Their 2 daughters, Lena Stallinger, 12, and Ina Stallinger, 8, were in town for the church event. The 2 girls were close friends with Mary Catherine Moore. They called home to ask if it would be okay if they stayed with the Moores for a sleepover. Their family agreed, so Josiah, Sarah, and the 6 children all left together to head for the Moore family home. The event ended at about 9:30 that night. It is believed that they all arrived back home sometime between 9:45 and 10 p.m. The 2 Stallinger sisters were put to bed in the parlor room on the first floor. This was used as a guest bedroom. Josiah and Sarah slept in the master bedroom at the top of the stairs, and the Moore children slept in their bedroom adjacent to their parents' room on the 2nd floor. The attic was also on the 2nd floor on the opposite wall of the master bedroom and the children's bedroom. It was Sunday night, June 9th, 1912. It had been a normal day in Villisca, Iowa, but that would all change by morning. Mary Peckman was the Moores' next-door neighbor. She was in her 60s, and just like everyone in those days, she had to get up early and do chores, feed the animals, and get ready for the day. She started work at 4 a.m. After a few hours of work, she realized how quiet the Moore house was, which was odd since they had 4 children, and children make noise. She noticed that no one had started their chores or had even gone to the outhouse the whole time she had been outside. She got curious and headed over. She knocked on their door, and when that failed, she tried to open the door, but it was locked. She tried to peek in through the windows, but all of the windows were covered, so she could not see in the Moore home. She walked over and let their chickens out, and then headed to her house and decided to call Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. She explained the situation to Ross. He had a spare key and found it odd that no one was awake in the house, so he headed over. He arrived and knocked on the front door, but no one answered. He tried shouting for his brother and sister-in-law. He eventually used the spare key to unlock the door and then walked inside while Miss Peckman waited on the front porch. He looked around the house, and it was much darker than normal. Every window was covered. He then opened the door to the parlor room where the Stollinger sisters were sleeping the night before. His heart sank with the image in front of him. The two girls lay dead on the bed. He quickly left and then told Miss Peckman to call the town marshal, Mr. Henry Horton. He was a small town marshal. Murder was very rare. He occasionally had to deal with drunks or hobos passing through from the railroad, but his little town was about to be turned upside down. Mass murder had come to Villisca. When Marshal Horton arrived, Ross Moore handed him the key and then he went inside. He saw the grisly scene in the downstairs parlor. The two Stollinger sisters had been bludgeoned while they slept. Their faces were covered. And Ina lay untouched, but Lena had been posed and her nightgown had been pulled up after her death by whatever sick individual had committed the murders. The murder weapon was an axe, and it was still in the parlor room. The mirror had been covered along with all the windows. There was a 4-pound slab of bacon on the floor in the parlor room. Marshal Horton made his way upstairs, not knowing what to expect next. The stairs led straight into the master bedroom. There was no hallway. He found Josiah and Sarah in the bed. Josiah had been severely deformed, and Sarah was not much better. Their faces were also covered. There were axe marks above their heads in the wall. It was a sloped wall, due to the shape of the roof. He then moved to the children's room. Herman, Catherine, Arthur, and Paul had all been killed. The children's faces had also been covered after their death. The marshal headed downstairs to Ross Moore on the porch, and he said,
"My God, Ross, there is someone murdered in every bed."
He locked the house and then he went to fetch the doctor and call for help from other agencies. The coroner eventually took control of the scene. The doctors believed that the murders happened sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. Word spread fast about the multiple murders. Sightseers started to trickle in, but people all over town closed up their shops and headed over to the Moore residence. That afternoon, hundreds of people surrounded the Moore house. When Dr. Cooper left, some of the men from the town wanted to take a look inside. That night, a flood of people entered the crime scene. Things were moved, some things were even taken. It is unknown how many people trampled through the crime scene, but some believe it was well over 100 people. Altering the evidence, moving objects, looking at the bodies, and possibly moving the victims. The bodies of the dead were not removed until midnight. A local druggist, or what we call today a pharmacist, brought a camera into the home and he tried to take photos of the scene, but he was thrown out. A local pool hall owner grabbed a piece of Josiah Moore's loose skull to keep it as a souvenir. He then put it in his pool hall. A police officer from another town arrived that night and restored order. He kicked all the sightseers out of the house and he secured the crime scene. But it was too late. Bloodhounds and their trainers arrived from Nebraska by train that night. They were given a scent off the axe and then set off to try and track the murderer. A large group followed the bloodhounds, a mixture of police and locals. The bloodhounds paused in front of Frank Jones's home for a short time. He was a prominent man in Villisca. Word spread that the bloodhounds stopped at his house and he was instantly a person of interest. The bloodhounds were out for a few hours tracking but did not find the murderer. It is not exactly sure how the suspect entered the home, but we know for sure that the suspect found the murder weapon in the backyard. The axe was Josiah Moore's own axe. However the suspect made his way into the home, he started in the downstairs parlor. He killed Lena and Ina first, with the blunt side of the axe. Some believed that Lena woke up and tried to escape, or fought back, because she was the only one found that was not laying in a sleeping position. But it is believed that Lena was killed while she slept, and then the murderer came back and posed her body later on. After he attacked Ina and Lena, he made his way upstairs, which led to Josiah and Sarah's room. The stairs are very noisy to this day and were just as loud in 1912, but it is believed that the suspect did not wake the sleeping parents. Josiah was hit first with the blunt side of the axe. There are axe marks in the wall above the pair's head from the cutting side of the axe. Some believe that the killer must have been short in size in order to hit the pair with the axe this way, due to the angle of the ceiling. Sarah was the only one in the entire home that was killed with the cutting edge of the axe. The killer angled the axe and then struck her after the axe was stuck in the ceiling. The killer made his way to the children's room and he finished his initial attack one by one. Every single blow from the axe on every victim was above the neck. After the initial attack, it is not exactly sure how everything played out, but it is believed that the killer came back and gave more blows to the victims. The killer covered all the victims' faces with clothing that he found inside the drawers. He walked around the house and closed all the curtains. For the windows that did not have curtains, he used tacks to pin up and cover the windows with clothes that he found. He also covered the mirrors in the home. The killer roamed the home and even made himself a plate of food, but he did not eat it. A bowl of bloody water was found in the kitchen by the food. In the downstairs parlor room, the mirror was covered. A small chain was found on the floor, believed to be from Josiah Moore's pocket watch. The axe was in the room. The killer had tried to clean the axe before discarding it. A 2 or 4 pound slab of bacon wrapped in a dish towel or something similar was found on the floor. The investigators did not know what it was for at the moment, but later on it is believed that the killer used this slab of bacon as a makeshift sexual item to pleasure himself. Lena was the only one moved and positioned. It is believed that this is why the bacon was in that room, wrapped in the dish towel, and then left on the floor. The children's room upstairs also had axe marks. When the killer left the home, he locked the door. He must have found the family's key and then left with it, locking the door behind him. The Reverend George Kelly was the only actual person charged for the murders, and he did actually confess. But many believe that he was coerced into confessing because of his mental illness or the police roughing him up to get a confession out of him. Reverend Kelly was invited to the church event where the Moores attended that night of the murder. Reverend Kelly was just 5'1" or 5'2", and he weighed about 120 pounds. A small man even for the time. Reverend Kelly left Villisca on the train a little after 5 a.m. the morning of the murders. About 1 week after the murders, George Kelly sent a blood-covered shirt to the cleaners in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Eventually, this information reached the investigators working on the murders. Reverend Kelly made his way to Villisca every few weeks, and he involved himself in the case. Word also reached investigators that Reverend Kelly had talked with 2 people, an older couple from one of his churches, on the train when he left Villisca the morning of the murders. He told them about the murders in Villisca, that an entire family had been killed. Reverend Kelly left shortly after 5 a.m., and the bodies were not discovered until sometime after 8 a.m. So there should have been no way he could have possibly known about the murders. Later on, Reverend Kelly wrote a letter to the police claiming that he had heard noises the night of the murder. The police brushed him off first, believing that he was just a crazy old man. Kelly was arrested in 1914 for sending obscene materials in the mail. Kelly had put an ad up in the paper for a stenographer for a novel he was working on. The opening of the ad read, "Girl stenographer, typewriter wanted, by gentlemen, for literary and artistic work." A woman replied to the letter applying for the job. Reverend Kelly answered that she could have the job, but the job required that she had to be in the nude while working for him and typing. She gave this information to the police, and they told the local postal authorities. The investigators for the postal authority wrote to Reverend Kelly until they had enough to officially arrest him. He was eventually found guilty, but he was found mentally ill and served his time at St. Elizabeth Hospital in Washington, D.C. While he was incarcerated, Reverend Kelly wrote the district attorney of Montgomery County, Iowa. He claimed that he was expecting to be arrested for the Villisca murders. A few years later, the police looked at Reverend Kelly more seriously for the murders, and he was indicted by a grand jury in 1917. He was interrogated many times, and he would eventually confess to the murders, claiming that God told him to slay, and slay utterly. He gave a full confession, but he later recanted shortly after. Some believe he was beaten during the interrogation, or the investigators coerced him due to his mental illness. He would have 2 trials. The first trial was about 4 weeks long. The jury would eventually be a hung jury. 11 voted to acquit Reverend Kelly, and 1 believed he was guilty, but insane. The second trial would end in an acquittal. This case was never truly solved. No one ever was convicted for the murders of the 8 people killed in Villisca, Iowa, that summer night in 1912. His name was Edward Theodore Gein. Ed's father's name was George, his mother Augusta, and his older brother Henry. Ed's mother was extremely religious, mainly conservative Lutheran with strict beliefs. She believed in the Bible wholeheartedly and used it to live her life and teach her sons how to live theirs. Augusta saw the world as sinful and full of temptations. She feared moral corruption from almost every corner of society. Augusta believed that all women, except for herself, were corrupt, sinful, and immoral. She believed women led men into sinful temptation. Augusta was completely against sexuality. That was also sinful. She was disgusted by sex. She discouraged Henry and Ed from having any relationships. Sexual desire was inherently evil in her mind. The only reason that she had children was because it was her religious duty. Augusta taught her children with an iron fist. She often berated them if they did not meet her strict moral standards. She would give daily Bible lessons and taught her children the dangers of sin. She read mostly from the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation. Ed's father George was an abusive alcoholic for most of his life. Even though he married Augusta, she hated him. George could barely hold down a job. He did mostly odd jobs as a carpenter, tanner, insurance salesman, and as a grocer. Augusta supported the family in La Crosse. She owned a small grocery store. Her husband worked there as a clerk before they left La Crosse. She absolutely hated George. She thought that he was worthless, and she did not want him raising their 2 sons. She believed that everyone in La Crosse was sinful. It was a larger town at around 30,000 people, and it had many bars. Augusta wanted her family to move into the country, away from such a corrupt society. When Ed was 8 years old, the family moved to Plainfield, Wisconsin, a tight-knit rural farming community with a few hundred residents. But Augusta would soon hate all of the residents. They were not up to her standards. They were sinful and immoral. Of course, Augusta was in charge of where the family would live, and she chose an isolated farmhouse with no electricity or plumbing on 155 acres of land. Ed and Henry went to a one-room schoolhouse with just 12 students. That was usually the only time Augusta allowed her sons to leave the family farm. When they weren't at school, they were either doing chores or working around the farm, or learning about the Bible from Augusta, or being beaten by their drunken father. Ed was an average student, and he loved reading, and he excelled at it. But in 1920, when Ed was 14, he dropped out of school. Ed did not have friends, and when he did try to make friends, his mother was completely against it. Ed would work on the family farm. His father's alcoholism would get worse, along with his abuse. On April 1st, 1940, George Gein, at age 66, would die from heart failure. His death now offered Henry and Ed a chance to leave the family farm during the day. They were allowed to go work odd jobs to bring in money. Henry and Ed both worked as handymen, but Ed would also babysit kids around town. The brothers got the reputation as trustworthy, good hard workers. Augusta favored Ed over Henry and made sure that he knew it. Ed had a strange attachment to his mother that went further than just being a mama's boy. Henry became worried about this and even criticized his mother around Ed. When Ed heard his brother talking badly about Augusta, he would become overly upset. After the start of World War II, Ed was forced to go to Milwaukee to get a physical. Ed had a growth in his eye which caused him to have bad vision. He failed the physical because of this. This was the only time that he had traveled so far from home. On May 16, 1944, Ed and Henry were burning brush in a marshy area on their property when the fire that they had lit got out of control and started spreading across the property and even endangered some of the surrounding farms. Ed supposedly became separated from Henry. Firefighters were called and went to contain the fire. After the fire was put out, Ed reported that his brother was missing. When the search party arrived, it was reported that Ed brought the searchers directly to Henry's body. He was laying face down on a burned part of the property, but his clothing was not burned and he did not have any burns on his body. They believed that he died from a heart attack since his body seemed unharmed. The police did not believe it was foul play. The coroner later found that the cause of death was asphyxiation. There was no autopsy or investigation into Henry's death. It has been reported that Henry had bruising on the back of his head, supposedly from hitting a rock after he fell, choking on the smoke and ash from the fire. But some believe that Ed killed his brother, or that Augusta ordered Ed to kill Henry. Ed could have hit Henry over the head, killed him, then lit the fire after the fact to give a reason for Henry's death. Whatever the case may be, Ed was never charged for his brother's death, and it is still considered an accident. After Henry's death, that just left Ed and Augusta alone on the farm, the abusive mother and dedicated son. A short time later, Augusta suffered a stroke that affected her mobility, so Ed had to become her primary caregiver. He would often have to carry her to move her around. This caused Ed to become even more attached to his mother. At age 67, Augusta Gein died on December 29, 1945, after suffering another stroke. Her death marked a significant turning point in Ed's life. He was now left completely alone, and his mother, who had been the backbone in his life, was now gone. Ed boarded up his mother's bedroom, the upstairs, downstairs parlor, and living room to preserve them and keep them just the way his mother left them. Ed's mother had insisted on keeping the house tidy when she was alive, or most likely she demanded that it be kept clean. Now that she was gone, Ed stayed in a small room by the kitchen and mainly used those two rooms. They increasingly became filthy, with the rooms he boarded up staying pristine. He refused to bathe himself. Ed began reading more books and magazines about human anatomy, cannibalism, and Nazi atrocities. Ed also began to leave the farm for work, doing odd jobs around town. He worked with the municipal road crew. He babysat and picked crops around Plainfield. He also sold 80 acres of land that his brother Henry owned. Mary Hogan was a 51-year-old tavern owner in Plainfield. She disappeared on December 8, 1954. She was known to speak her mind and cursed like a sailor. Her tavern was a place for locals to wind down after a hard day of work, including Ed Gein. Witnesses found blood stains on the floor of the tavern, along with an empty bullet casing. Her body was missing, but a trail of blood made police think that Mary was no longer alive. The case went cold due to little evidence. It was reported Ed joked about the woman not being missing, that she was back at his farm, but no one in Plainfield believed his jokes. On November 16, 1957, it was the first day for deer season in Wisconsin, so most of the men in Plainfield were out in the woods that day deer hunting. Then, as it is today, deer hunting was a big deal in Wisconsin. The previous day, Ed Gein visited Bernice Warden's hardware store in Plainfield to ask about the price of antifreeze, and stated that he would return the following morning to purchase half a gallon. The next day was expected to be slow due to deer season, but the hardware store remained open. Bernice's son, Frank Warden, was a sheriff's deputy. He entered his mother's store that afternoon to find the cash register missing. A rifle had been moved from the rack, and a trail of blood on the floor leading to the back. Frank Warden raised the alarm about his mother's disappearance. Frank suspected Ed Gein immediately, since Ed had taken a liking to his mother, but Bernice did not share the same feelings towards Ed. Also, the last receipt that Bernice had written up that day was for antifreeze. Authorities obtained a search warrant for Ed Gein's property, and Ed was arrested that night. The police entered the summer kitchen behind Ed's farmhouse and began searching. Bernice Warden's body was found decapitated and hung upside down by her ankles. She had been cut open and cleaned out. That image horrified the investigators. At first they thought it had been a dressed deer hanging from the rafters, but it was the body of Bernice. She had been killed by a .22 caliber rifle, then taken to the back of the store. A vehicle was seen driving off from behind the building at around 9:30 that morning. When the investigators moved into the farmhouse, they were not prepared for the horrors they would uncover. I'm going to leave out most of the details, but the information is out there. We will go over just the basics. Bernice Warden's heart was found in a plastic bag in front of Ed's wood stove, and her head was inside of a sack. Human skulls had been affixed to the posts of Ed's bed. There was furniture made out of bone and skin. Human bones were found scattered around the house. A trash can was made from human skin. The tops of skulls had been made into bowls. Ed made a corset out of a female torso. There were leggings made from skin, masks made from the faces of victims. Mary Hogan's face was found. Ed had turned it into a mask, which police found in a paper bag. Her skull was also found inside of his house. Body parts from teenage women, a belt made from female body parts, a lampshade and chair made from human skin, a suit made from the skins of deceased women, which Ed reportedly wore to try and become more like his mother. There were countless body parts and bones around the property. Some had even been turned into tools, and the list goes on and on. After Ed's arrest, he was questioned by police. He claimed that between 1947 and 1952, he was involved in grave robbing at 3 local cemeteries. He claimed he was in a dazed state, and most of the time he would come out of his daze and leave the cemetery without grave robbing. But there were occasions where he succeeded in grave robbing during his dazed state. He would grave rob from people who had recently died. At night, he would dig down, retrieve the victim, and then cover the grave back the way he had found it. He used the skills his father had taught him as a tanner. The police did not believe him at first. They did not possibly think that he could dig down, rob the grave, and then cover it perfectly all in one night. The police went to test his confession and dug up a few graves to see if he was telling the truth. One casket was completely empty. Ed's crowbar was found in another, and parts of another body were missing. Ed had removed some jewelry and left it inside the grave. The exact number of victims is unknown, since only a few graves were tested. Ed would eventually confess to the murders of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. He shot Bernice with a .22 caliber rifle, and he shot Mary with a .32 caliber pistol. There are possibly more victims that Ed Gein murdered, but none have been proven. Unfortunately, Ed Gein's confession was ruled inadmissible at court. During questioning, Sheriff Art Schley reportedly smashed Ed Gein's head against a brick wall. This act caused his first confession to be thrown out. The sheriff was traumatized by the search and horrors he witnessed. He died young at age 43. It was believed this trauma caused his early death. Ed was initially declared incompetent to stand trial due to his mental illness. He was sent to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Ed Gein's belongings were supposed to be auctioned on March 30th, 1958 to the highest bidder. But 10 days before the auction, Ed Gein's farmhouse caught fire and was burned to the ground with all of its belongings inside. The official explanation was that a trash pile that was being burned by a cleaning crew in preparation for the auction had spread to the house, but there is no real evidence found of this. Arson was suspected, but never confirmed. The locals definitely did not want the house to become a House of Horrors sideshow in their town. Some believe local citizens or local police burned the house down to keep its contents from being spread into the public. Ed Gein was told about the fire, and it is said that he just shrugged his shoulders and said, "Just as well." Ed Gein's 1949 Ford sedan was auctioned off for $760, which is worth about $8,000 in 2024, to a carnival sideshow owned by Bunny Gibbons. It would be known as the Ed Gein Ghoul Car. It was traveled around, and Bunny Gibbons charged 25 cents admission to see the sideshow. 2,000 people came to see the car in the first 2 days of the show. In 1968, after another evaluation, Ed was found competent to stand trial. It started on November 7, 1968. A psychiatrist testified that Ed told him that the morning of the murder, Ed was looking over a rifle at the hardware store when the weapon discharged and killed Bernice. He claimed he was not sure if it was by accident or on purpose. He did not remember anything else from that morning. His trial had no jury. A judge would decide Ed's fate. The judge declared that Ed Gein was guilty of Bernice Worden's murder. A second trial was held to decide if Ed was sane at the time of the murder. Ed Gein was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Because of the costs for another trial, he was not charged in the murder of Mary Hogan, even though he confessed to the murder. Ed Gein did well in the mental health system. He again had order in his life and someone to tell him what to do every day. After his mother's death, he had spiraled out of control, and now he was doing better in the mental institution. Ed Gein died from complications due to lung cancer on July 26, 1984. He was 77 years old. I want to thank y'all for watching this, folks. I know it was a tough one with a lot of horrible information in this episode, but history is history, and I hope you enjoyed nonetheless. We will see you on the next one, folks. Peace.